Welcome to our first lecture of the semester. This is entitled Course Overview and Intro to the Endocrine System. However, we will skip the course overview and go straight into the introduction to the endocrine system. This is chapter 17 in your textbook. So let's take a look at our outline for today's lecture. We'll first look at the overview of the endocrine system. This is just the first section of your textbook. I'll talk about cell-to-cell communication. Several ways to do this. One of them, of course, is through hormones, which will be the focus of our chapter. We'll look at a comparison between the nervous and endocrine systems. At the end of A&P 1 last semester, we looked at the nervous system. So now we'll go straight into the endocrine system, look at those similarities and the differences, because they both act as control systems, but in different ways. And then for part C of this, we'll look at hormone nomenclature, which is just a system of naming. Then we'll specifically start looking at the glands themselves, the hypothalamus and pituitary gland. So let's start with cell-to-cell communication, and we'll look at the four main ways this might happen. The first mechanism is through what are called gap junctions. We saw this when we studied smooth muscle back in A&P 1. Gap junctions are proteins that are embedded in the membrane, and they essentially form channels, or pores, through which molecules can pass. When gap junctions on adjacent cells line up with each other, they form a pore that directly connects the cytoplasms of the two adjoining cells. And so signaling molecules can pass from one cell directly to another cell. This can be, for example, this could be a charged particle like calcium or sodium that might depolarize one cell, travel to the next cell, and depolarize it as well. Our second method of cell-to-cell communication are neurotransmitters. These are released by neurons. We studied these in A&P 1 as well. Examples would be acetylcholine or norepinephrine or GABA. These are released from the axon terminals and travel across the cleft, bind to receptors on the following cell. Could be a target cell, could be a subsequent neuron. The third method of communicating between cells, this might be a new term to us. These are called paracrines. Paracrines are molecules that are secreted from cells, so this is probably via exocytosis. The molecule is then released out into the extracellular fluid. It then travels to a nearby cell within the same tissue, or maybe at least a nearby tissue, and then activates that cell by binding to its receptor. So these are sometimes called local hormones, but as we'll see from the next definition, they technically are not hormones because they do not enter the bloodstream. And that brings us to our fourth mechanism for cell-to-cell communication, and that is hormones. And of course, hormones will be the focus of this chapter because they are the signaling molecule that make up the endocrine system. The other part, of course, is the glands, which we'll take a look at as well. So hormones, by definition, are chemical messengers that are transported by the bloodstream. So they are released from endocrine glands, they enter the bloodstream, travel to the rest of the body, and activate their target cells. So now that we've introduced the idea of a hormone, let's look at some of the common glands. This is from figure 17.1 in your text, and these are some of the glands that we're going to take a look at. There's the thyroid gland. The thymus is also sits at the anterior part of our chest. We won't look at this too much. It has to do with immunity. We have the adrenal gland. We have two of these. These sit on top of the kidneys. The pancreas, important for digestive enzymes, but also as for secreting hormones, important in blood glucose management. And then down at the bottom we have, since this is a male, we have testis. Of course, if it were female, we would be showing ovaries. However, the first part of the chapter, we'll be looking at two glands that aren't shown on this picture, and that is because they're very small, and they're up in the brain, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. But before we get into that, we'll talk a little bit more about the comparison between the nervous and the endocrine systems. In comparing the nervous and endocrine systems, some of these features of the nervous system we will certainly be familiar with, but the endocrine system might be a bit new. But first off, we know that the nervous system will secrete neurotransmitters. This is our number one here. whereas the endocrine system will use hormones as its signaling molecule. For number 2, a nervous system will use synapses to communicate from cell to cell, whereas the endocrine system, of course, will release its messengers, its hormones, into the bloodstream. The third comparison, this is how the general area of the effects are. The nervous system, because it releases neurotransmitter at a specified spot, its effects tend to be local. Whereas, since endocrine system releases its hormones into the blood and then can travel anywhere, they have very either general or widespread effects. Sometimes you'll see these called systemic effects. And finally, the nervous system can react generally very quickly, sometimes within milliseconds, right? Whereas the endocrine system is usually more slow. The stimulus will need to be relayed to the gland then secretes the hormone, which is released and then goes and acts on its target cells. This could be anywhere from seconds to minutes to days to weeks, right? So much more slow response and generally more long-lived as well. Some of those comparisons are shown in this figure, which is figure 17.2 in your text. We can see that at the top we have a neuron and then some of its target cells, and of course the neuron is releasing neurotransmitter, whereas at the bottom panel we have the endocrine system, where we have a capillary bed on the left that are surrounded by endocrine cells, and then on the right would be the target cells. And so clearly on the left is the release of hormones that then enter the bloodstream. They travel to some other spot in the body to the target cells, where they then bind to the receptors and elicit some sort of an action. The final point to make in this opening section is the idea about nomenclature. And there are lots and lots of hormones, as you'll see. This is table 17.2 in your textbook. This is only some. The list here is only some of the hormones. We won't look at all of these, but we will look at most of them. There is a widely accepted set of abbreviations for these hormones. You should know the full name as well as the abbreviation. However, if on an exam or a lab assignment you want to just use the abbreviation, that is perfectly acceptable. I will assume that you know what the hormone is when you refer to its abbreviation. And we can just name through some here. ACTH at the very top, Adrenocorticotropic Hormone. We'll be mentioning that a little later today. Some of the ones that might be familiar with you further down. Growth hormone is right here. We'll talk about that today as well. Here's norepinephrine, which we've mentioned before as a neurotransmitter, right? It's also a hormone. And thyroid hormone, which sets the metabolic rate down here. Those are just some of the familiar ones. By the end of the chapter, all of these will be familiar to you. My one piece of advice regarding this table is to learn them as soon as possible. By the end of the week, you should have all of these memorized so that when we mention them in class, you know exactly what we're talking about. So now that you've had a general introduction to the endocrine system, let's go look at the specific glands, beginning with the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. These two are always the first two glands that are covered in textbooks. And you've probably often heard the term, the pituitary gland is also called the master gland. Well, we'll learn a bit about that, and you'll see why it might actually be the hypothalamus rather than the pituitary. But they come first because they control so many processes and they secrete quite a few hormones, as we're going to see. But before we get to that, let's look at the anatomy. These glands are located in the brain. I have circled here in the upper figure the hypothalamus, which we learned in our brain anatomy from A&P 1. This is this section of the brain here. And then the pituitary gland sits below that. And they are actually connected by this thin stalk of tissue. This is called the infundibulum. Also sometimes just called the stalk. If we move now to figure 17.4 in your textbook, we can look at a diagram that's a little bit more blown up of these structures. Obviously at the top we have hypothalamus. This is the area up here. And then at the bottom of the figure, we have the pituitary gland, and we can see that it is divided into two portions. This brown portion is called the anterior pituitary, sometimes called the adenohypophysis, and the posterior pituitary is this lighter tan color, sometimes called the neurohypophysis. The anterior pituitary is more like a gland. It actually has glandular tissue, whereas the posterior pituitary, and also called the neurohypophysis, it's so called because it's actually still nervous tissue. It has neurons and the other nervous tissue that we studied back in A&P1. To look at the anatomy and the hormones involved, let's keep with this figure right here and concentrate on the anterior pituitary. So first, some of the anatomy. We can see some of the labels here. In the hypothalamus, we have a set of capillaries called the primary capillaries. Those are located there. I'm going to switch to green because it shows up better on this. We also have a secondary set of capillaries. These are called the secondary capillaries here. And they are connected by what are called portal venules. They get the name here, this portal venules, because this is a portal system. I think we mentioned this before at some point in A&P1. A portal system is a set of capillaries in which the blood will flow through, go through a set of veins or a venule, and then enter a second set of capillaries. That's an unusual arrangement because usually it just goes through one set of capillaries and then the blood will go to the veins and then back to the heart. But in this case, we will have a primary set of capillaries, a venule, and then a secondary set of capillaries. We'll see this again when we do digestive system and as well as in the kidneys. But overall, this arrangement is not all that common. Now that we've seen the anatomy of these vessels, we'll see why it's important. So the hypothalamus will produce hormones. Those are actually listed right here in this box. We'll get to that in a second. It secretes the hormones. Those hormones enter the primary capillaries. They will travel down the portal venules, enter the secondary capillaries, and then they will signal the anterior pituitary to either release its hormones or they will inhibit it from releasing hormones. So let's take a look at those hypothalamic hormones. And I'll go ahead and I'll write the abbreviation as we go along. Gonadotropin releasing hormone. This is called GnRH. GnRH. Thyrotropin releasing hormone. Most of these are very self-explanatory. TRH, and you can even look back at the table that contains all of the hormones. Corticotropin releasing hormones, CRH. Prolactin inhibitory hormone, PIH. Growth hormone releasing hormone, GHRH. And then somatostatin doesn't have an abbreviation. Notice that the names of these hormones are often releasing hormones with one inhibiting hormone. That describes what they're doing. So they are released by the hypothalamus, and then they travel to the anterior pituitary to either cause the release of a hormone or the inhibition of a hormone. Now let's move to the anterior pituitary and look at its hormones. It releases 6, and let's label them here as well as look at the abbreviations. So follicle stimulating hormone is FSH, and luteinizing hormone is LH. These both act on the ovaries and testes, so they are involved in the reproductive system. We'll take a look at their functions in much more detail in the reproductive system at the end of the semester. But just for now, we can see they are named for what they do in the female. Follicle stimulating hormone obviously stimulates the development of follicles in the ovaries. Those are the structures that envelop the ovum or the eggs. And luteinizing hormone causes ovulation and then the formation of the corpus luteum. Thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, as its name suggests, it stimulates the thyroid gland to produce thyroid hormone. That helps set our metabolic rate. Adrenocorticotropic hormone is ACTH. We can tell from the name, at least partly what it does. It stimulates the adrenal gland. That's the adrenal part. And cortico means it acts on the cortex. So it stimulates the adrenal cortex to release some of its hormones. And this is a hormone that is released during stressful times, either emotional stress or physical stress. Prolactin is PRL. This is a hormone that stimulates milk production in mammary glands. And last one is GH, growth hormone, which, as its name suggests, activates growth in all of our tissues. But as we'll see later, most of those effects might be mediated through another hormone called insulin-like growth factor. So that's the anterior pituitary and its hormones. Let's jump now to the posterior pituitary and look at its anatomy as well as its secreted hormones. We start with the same figure, except now we're going to look at the posterior aspect of the pituitary gland, but we still have, at the top here, the hypothalamus. It is still important, and what's important about the hypothalamus in this is the neurons that are located in the hypothalamus, and we have several groups of neurons that we're going to look at here. Those are labeled here, the paraventricular nucleus, which is the blue, supraoptic nucleus here in green. Remember from our vocabulary words from A&P1 on the nervous system, a nucleus, or plural nuclei, within the central nerve is a collection of neuron cell bodies, or soma, in the central nervous system. So these are groups of cell bodies sitting here. They have a common function, and the hypothalamus has lots of nuclei, a dozen or so that are named. Two of them just happen to be here, the paraventricular and the supraoptic. Let's continue on looking at the anatomy. Of course, what they do is they send their axons down the stalk, the infundibulum, and they terminate in axon terminals in the posterior pituitary. And this is where they will release hormones. It actually looks like it would be the release of a neurotransmitter because they're coming from the axon, but once they enter the bloodstream, they become hormones. The two hormones that are released are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. Oxytocin, sometimes you'll see it as OT. Antidiuretic hormone is ADH. These hormones are produced in the hypothalamus, in the cell bodies of these neurons. Oxytocin is produced in the paraventricular nucleus, and ADH is produced in the supraoptic nucleus. They are then transported down the axons and put in vesicles at the axon terminals, and then once they are stimulated, they will release the oxytocin and ADH, and those will enter the bloodstream and then act as hormones on their way to their target organs. For their functions, we know that ADH is related to water retention. It signals the kidney to hold on to water rather than let it go into urine. And oxytocin, we know more about it in females. It stimulates uterine contractions during labor and also stimulates milk release while nursing. So there's our overview of the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary, the anatomy, the hormones. So now let's go take a look at the interaction between the two. In this diagram, this is figure 17.6 in your text. It's attempting to show the relationship between the release of hormones from the hypothalamus, which is shown at the top. The release of at least 4 of the hormones here. What are we missing? We're missing PIH, prolactin inhibiting hormone, and somatostatin. But we see the releasing hormones. And then subsequently, the anterior pituitary and the release of its hormones. So if we follow the arrows down, we can see TRH is thyrotropin releasing hormone, GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone. The blue is CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone, and then GHRH is growth hormone releasing hormone. All 4 of those hormones are going to stimulate the release of their respective hormones from the anterior pituitary. And then the anterior pituitary, it's shown here, releases prolactin. We don't have a releasing hormone for that. But TRH, will stimulate the release of TSH. In the green, GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone, will stimulate the release of LH and FSH. In the blue, the CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone, will stimulate the release of ACTH. And then it will go act on the adrenal cortex. And you can also see their target organs here, of course, for all of these. Growth hormone releasing hormone will activate the release of growth hormone. And here we can see, again, some of the ways growth hormone might work. It will directly act on cells and tissues to cause growth, but it has a very short half-life. It doesn't last very long in the blood. However, it does activate the liver to produce another set of hormones called insulin-like growth factor. There are a couple of these, IGF-1 and IGF-2. IGF-1 seems to be more effective in as we get older, childhood through adolescence and adults, and it's the IGFs that tend to act on tissue because IGF lasts a lot longer in the bloodstream. It has a much longer half-life. Finally, let's take a look at the control of the release of these hormones, and this is done through a negative feedback loop. Shown here in figure 17.7 is the relationship between hypothalamus, pituitary, and the thyroid gland. And so we're going to see some of these hormones and how they act. So if we take it just one step at a time, let's go to the number one. We have TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone. It's released from the hypothalamus. It travels through the portal venules into the secondary capillaries. It then, here's the little plus sign, right? It stimulates TSH release from the anterior pituitary. That TSH will then enter the blood and will stimulate the thyroid gland. This is on the anterior part of your throat. And this gland will produce thyroid hormone. It actually has two types. We'll see this in future lectures. Thyroid hormone consists of a T3 and a T4. We don't need those details yet. When those are released, they will go to their target organs and they will stimulate a higher metabolic rate. So if you have lots of thyroid hormone in your body, your metabolic rate might seem really high. You might feel hot or sweaty or hungry all the time. Whereas if you have low thyroid hormone, you'll feel lethargic and sluggish and tired because your metabolism will be low. But notice the red line here. We also have a negative feedback loop back to both the hypothalamus and the pituitary. And so those red negative signs show that as thyroid hormone levels increase, they will have a negative impact, a negative feedback on the hypothalamus and the pituitary, so that they will decrease TRH and decrease TSH levels until they level off. And then as thyroid hormone levels decline, of course that negative feedback will be removed, and then TRH will go up, followed by TSH. And so this is the way to keep those levels regulated. So that covers the reading for the first lecture. I'll leave you with this. The page is assigned 613 to 623, and then a set of questions and activities that will guide you through the reading. Consider this your study guide for the first exam. I'll have a set of guiding questions like this for each reading assignment. And also just a set of vocabulary words. Don't spend too much time reading and studying these. I expect you to know them for the test. I hardly will have any questions on what is the definition of and then a particular word. I'll just assume that you know them. So it's a good way to check how your studying is going. So that concludes Lecture 1.